Thank you. Raise your hands if you'd like to have more happiness, fulfillment, and contentment in your life. Excellent. Well, over the next 3.5 hours, that was funnier in my head, I want to share with you what I believe to be a life hack that actually does help us produce more happiness, fulfillment, and contentment in our lives. And I stumbled across this in the most unassuming way. In fact, in 1989, that was a picture of me. I was one of those people you'd see in the downtown east side or even up here around Granville Street Mall, pushing a shopping cart, collecting cans and bottles. I was probably at my lowest point in life. To say I was unhappy is an understatement. I struggled with mental illness. I struggled with suicide thoughts. I struggled with heart addiction to heroin. And I was homeless. I lived actually under the Georgia Street Viaduct about 5 blocks from here. So my story begins 30 years ago on a park bench with one promise. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that it didn't start here. There was a time in my life when I was extraordinarily happy. I grew up in a little town in Midland, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half north of Toronto. And I can remember my life as a little boy being really happy. I was happy-go-lucky. I had a bike. I had a tree fort. I had an older brother, younger sister, an awesome dad and mom, and everything was extraordinary. My father was this kind of guy who was this larger-than-life man. He used to spend time with us and us kids. And he used to say things to us like, I love you, you can do and be anything. In his shadow, I felt safe, protected, secure, and happy. One day we woke up, and just like that, Dad was gone. And our family went through this enormous shift. And the man who would then replace my father, my stepfather, he wasn't anything like my dad. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so I went from a man who instilled confidence and love in his children with messages like, you can do anything, to a man who would say things like, you're worthless, you're stupid, and you'll never amount to anything. And so at the age of 9, I had a lot of stuff going on. And I had this fracture in my self-worth. And I started to believe that I wasn't worth it. I don't know if you can identify with that, but I just didn't feel like I was good at sports. I wasn't necessarily the best at academics. I was awkward growing up. And I wasn't happy inside. But back then, we didn't have the mechanisms and the conversations that we have today. So what ended up happening is an opportunity to escape into drugs presented itself. And I took that opportunity, and I made that incredibly poor choice. And I joined not because I was curious about doing drugs. I was really just wanting to belong and connect and be a part of something else. Over the next several months and years, my life spiraled out of control. What initially gave me some kind of comfort and ability to deal with emotional uncertainty began to destroy my life from the inside. By the time I was 15, I was angry. I was pushing back at the world. I was rebellious. I got into a fight with my stepfather, and just like that, I was out of the house. At 16, I dropped out of school. At 17, I went to prison for the first time. I just couldn't seem to find myself. I wore my welcome out in that small little town. And so one day I thought it was a good idea to jump on a bus and come out here to Vancouver. 3.5 days later, I got off the bus at Georgia Street, and the life for the next several years spiraled right out of control. I found myself in rooming houses, wandering the streets of Granville and Seymour and downtown East Hastings, and I couldn't seem to find the bigger part of myself. 3 days before Christmas, 1989, I had one of the worst days of my life. You see, by that time, I didn't have any supports. I wasn't dealing with the mental health stuff. I didn't have housing, and I struggled in this spiral of addiction. And I remember sitting on that park bench, rocking back and forth as I descended into withdrawal. And all I could think about was where I was going to get that next $10. I remember looking down at my feet, and the only item I had left in the world that was worth anything was the boots I was wearing. I walked into the bar across the street, and I sold those boots. And I walked out into the street, and I was at the lowest place that I could possibly be in the Western world. And all I could think about was, any way that I could negotiate my way out of this life. I did something different that day. Instead of acting on those thoughts, I made a promise. And that's when my life began to turn around. I sat down on that park bench and I cried out and asked for help. And I made a deal with God. And I said, if you get me out of this, I promise I'll turn my life around and I'll do something to help others. Now, I am incredibly fortunate because I still had one champion in my life. I called my mom. She came out here to Vancouver. She scooped me up. She brought me back to Ontario, where I entered a full recovery and detox program. And after 6 months, I entered into Loyalist College as a mature student. And I had these really great college professors who began to believe in me and began to help me and began to work through my false belief system. And I started to flourish and do incredibly well. And after 3.5 years, I walked across the stage in a room just like this, a little bit bigger. And they called out my name. They said, Joe Roberts, Dean's List. I graduated with a 3.94 GPA. It is amazing. It is amazing what we can accomplish when we step through fear. Oftentimes we stop short in life, the things that scare us. I truly believe that it's taking action in the face of negative emotion that will show you to yourself. After graduating college, I needed to get a job, and I decided to take a risk and come back out here. I had a brother that lived in Richmond, and so I got my U-Haul truck and I moved out here. And after a few jobs and sales, I had a friend of mine asked if I would like to start a tech startup company with him. And I didn't even know what he was talking about, but I said sure. And I followed his direction. I did the same things that they taught me how to do in school, that those great educators taught me and instilled in me. After 4.5 years, the distance between the time I was on the street to the time this one day when I was driving through the downtown east side was over 12 years. And as I was driving through the downtown east side one day, I got to my office in Yaletown, and sitting on my desk was a copy of Canadian Business, and I was on the cover of it as a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur. In less than 12 years, I went from pushing a shopping cart to being the Canadian version of the American dream. And I had it all. I had everything that they teach us in the Western world that brings happiness. I had money, I had a big house, I had a big car, I had all the latest electronic toys, and yet on many days I wasn't any more fulfilled. So in 2003, I stepped back from my role in the corporate world and began to do things that had a lot more meaning and purpose and passion for me. In fact, one of those things is what I'm doing today. One of the things I love to do more than anything in the world is stand in front of a group of people and inspire them with a new set of thoughts and ideas that will empower them to go out in the world and discover what they have and what their potential is. You know, it was in a conversation much like that with my friend Dr. Sean Richardson, who's a premier sports psychologist, where I said to Sean, I want to do something to make good on that second promise, that promise I made on that park bench 30 years ago. I want to do something to pay it forward. I want to do something right across this great country of ours that shines a light on some of the issues that impact youth at risk. Issues that impacted me as a young man growing up. And it was in that conversation that we started to talk about inspiring Canadians and the types of formats they use to create awareness and raise dollars. And one name came up. You know, when I was 13 years old, in Barrie, Ontario, I met Terry Fox, and he inspired us, and he inspired our entire nation. And so it was in that context. Sean said to me, he said, Joe, why don't you follow that model? And why don't you run or walk across Canada? And I said, well, how would that be different than some of the other campaigns that have already happened? He said, well, why don't you push a shopping cart? No one's ever pushed a shopping cart across Canada. It's a symbol of chronic homelessness. It's an outcome that you're trying to avoid for every single young person. And along the way, I'm sure you'll inspire people and be able to elevate the conversation on what we need to do to better protect young Canadians. So the first problem we had was a shopping cart. Because I don't know about you, every time I go to the grocery store, I always get the shopping cart with the wheel that doesn't work. So we needed a shopping cart that we could push through the winter and on the side of the road. And so we went and we worked with a group at Pine Tree Secondary School in Coquitlam. Yeah, and they were really smart. We wanted them to modify a shopping cart. They said, don't modify it. Use something that's already like a shopping cart. And we said, what's that? They said, a baby carriage. And so we went out and we got ourselves a baby carriage from Chariot Carrier, and we got a local metal fabricator to put on some welding so it actually kind of looked like a shopping cart. And so we had one problem of 9,999 solved. Over the course of the next 4 years, with the help and dedication of a team of people, we began to slowly put together this national campaign. And for the organizers here at this event today, you know how difficult it is putting these kinds of community engagement projects together. It's absolutely overwhelming. We looked at this 17-month campaign across the country where I would walk over 9,000 kilometers. We'd have to walk through one Canadian winter. We would trek through 10 provinces, visit the 3 northern territories, and we had over 400 planned and scheduled events. What happened next was absolutely inspirational and had nothing to do with my walk. It had to do with how Canadians responded to that work. Finally, we were ready. We had our driver and our vehicles and our support team in Cape Spear, Newfoundland, where we had planned to start walking from east to west. And on the 1st of May, 2016, I began an epic walk across the second widest country in the world. This is what happened.
Joe, you're a great guy, and you're a great Canadian, and I know you're helping all the kids, and God love you.
Yeah. When it was all said and done, I walked 11,375,000 steps, 9,064 kilometers. But what was amazing isn't that we walked across the country with a shopping cart. It was how we engaged and how we elevated that conversation and how people responded to that. And you got a bit of a taste of it in the video. When we walked into Ontario, we had the full support of the Ontario Provincial Police. You see, that small promise that we made elicited other promises. And so when we walked over from Quebec into Ontario, we were met by Commissioner Vince Hawks. And beside Vince is none other than the greatest hockey dad in the world, Walter Gretzky. So that was pretty cool. When we got to Toronto, we were met by Rod Black, the cast from Degrassi. And we even had CFL legend Michael Pinball Clemens support us when we reached Dundas Square. We even got a call that week from Mark and Craig Kilberger from We Day, and I was invited. By the way, if you're afraid of public speaking, the AC may not be your best place to, you might want to try a TEDx event out for it. It was absolutely extraordinary, but as much as those days were filled with, those key events, there was a lot of days where it was just plain difficult. But what was interesting is that as I left the corporate world and we were really running this campaign, is that even though it was hard, we were filled with a sense of fulfillment and contentment and joy. Many, many days I woke up in Northern Ontario, and every morning I woke up at 5 and I walked 24 kilometers, rain, snow, or shine. And so there were a lot of days where it was really, really difficult. And as we got north of Sault Ste. Marie, it got weird. And then it got weirder. We posted this on our social media channels, and my mom phoned me, and she says, "You darn kids and your selfies, you're doing dangerous, the bear is behind you." And I said, "Mom, it's Photoshop." She says, "I don't care what kind of bear it is." Along the way, we had some extraordinary experience. Now, one of the things that I'd be chagrined if I didn't mention is that Marie, who's with us today somewhere taking pictures, she was my rock. She was my partner. She was my campaign director. And so anytime we're taking on big challenges or taking on projects, it's so important to do it in a team. Marie managed all the back end of the campaign, and she worked tirelessly and was as committed to my promise with her own promise, with over 5 years of her volunteerism. The Push for Change wouldn't have happened without her. So I think we should give her a little bit of a... Quickly, we've got a story. Of course, we're husband and wife, but Marie and I actually met in grade 10. And we dated. She was my first love, and we lost track of each other, but reconnected 28 years later. How cool is that, right? Yeah. The biggest thing that we experienced during our campaign was how people supported this. During the Walk Across Canada, we engaged in over 350 schools and got a chance to connect with over 100,000 young people. And it was the projects that these young people did as we went through those communities that absolutely blew us away and inspired us. We would show up in places like Nipigon or Saskatoon or Sault Ste. Marie, and the kids would have done a drive to collect hats or toques, or they had done a sleep out, or they'd done a nickel or a loonie drive. They were doing all these little promises and all these little activations on pieces of the issue that were so important. And in the process, they were learning and they were growing and they were being connected to these important social issues. And when I got a chance to talk to them, I always asked them, I said, well, what did you get out of it? And the young people would say, well, we learned about the issues. We learned about ourselves. Most of all, we felt happy helping other people. It was in the spirit of that our foundation, when we completed our walk, started the Promise Project. And it's a really, really simple idea. It's providing educators and students all across the country with a toolkit that will empower them to go out in their community, pick a project they're passionate about, form a group, and do an activation. We believe that we can change social issues one promise at a time. You know, every single one of us, in one way, shape, or another, is looking for change. Today, you heard from so many change makers, people who are passionate about things in their lives. I don't think you need to convince people to do the right thing. You simply got to provide them that opportunity. I believe in a lot of ways, my generation and the generation before has created an environment where our focus has been on materialism. And although having things and being comfortable is nice, ultimately, study after study after study shows that altruism, volunteerism, and connectingness to other human beings brings us a richer and more fulfilled life. The paradox of giving of our time, treasure, and talent and getting away from selfish endeavors is that we actually become richer in the process. So my challenge to you is to find a promise and a project you're passionate about. Form a team and get started today. You know, I love the Beatles, and one of my favorite quotes from Paul McCartney in a song is, "And in the end, the love we take is equal to the love we make." My story and journey to happiness happened on a park bench 5 blocks from here with one promise over 30 years ago. As I stand here today, I can't help but wonder where your life's going to be 30 years from now. The impact that you have will depend on the promises that you make and the people that you connect with along the way. So I encourage you to get busy today, because who knows? In the end, the life you change and the happiness that you create might very well be your own. Thanks.